but things go the way they go, and here we are. So I'm really happy to see you, and I'm happy.
I just got the joke, but thank you.
Well, listen, it takes some people a while. That's thanks to my mom. Hi, Mom. I'm really, really excited to be here and to be hosting another series for you. The title is Images of a People, as you see, Jews in Art, and it's kind of a riff off something that is going to happen this spring, which is that I am happily going to release, Penn State University Press, a book called People of the Image, Jews and Art, right? And I've spoken in this class, in this context of CSP a lot about Jews making art or art being made for Jews. And so I'm really excited that this book, which has been many years in the making, is finally coming out. It is coming out in no small measure due to you, supporters and patrons of CSP, because many of the chapters in the book emerged as developments of talks that I gave at CSP, and as a result of your very kind, thoughtful, and often stimulating input. So I'm really happy about that, and let's see if this one wins another award, but it's not about winning awards, it's about getting ideas out there. So I hope that when it does come out, I'll be able to offer it to CSP members. As Ari said, this is a 6-part series, and the parts are interconnected. Today we'll be talking about the earliest images of Jews, Jews as an object of fascination in ancient times, early medieval times. The next time, November 14th, I'll talk about exemplification. That is, when you see Jews who appear in art, you might expect, because of what you know of anti-Semitism, that Jews appearing in art are always going to be in a negative context. But in fact, because Christianity and Islam saw Jewish history as integrally related to the building block and foundation of their own history, whatever they actually thought of living Jews, they had a great deal of respect for dead ones, right? That is, ancient monarchs, priests, and prophets. And we're going to see how those persons are dealt with in the artistic heritage, and how one gets around the fact that one may, at any given point in history, hate actual Jews, but one, in fact, loves King David and the prophet Elijah, etc. It's a fascinating topic. Then on November 21st, how did the idea of Jews as demonic, as the root of all evil, develop? And I want to start, this is one of 2 sessions on anti-Semitic images. And this is really about anti-Jewish images. It's about how the Judaism of Jews, the fact that Jews were Jewish, was deemed to be problematic and the root, in fact, of all evil. On December 19th, we'll move from anti-Judaism, that is, being against the religion, to anti-Semitism, which is about the racial or ethno-racial categorization of Jews. And we'll talk about Jews in modernity and postmodernity being depicted as doing terrible things, whether it's being predacious economically, or being misogynistic in terms of mixing inappropriately with Christians, etc. Those are sort of racial characterizations, not indictments or attacks on Jewish religion. And of course, questions of Jewish nationalism and Zionism come into those images, because those images often critique Jewish national aspirations. But in between demonization and anti-Semitism, we're going to devote 1 session to the Jewish Jesus, a topic that I've discussed at length here, and in fact last time with Amy Jill Levine. Jewish Jesus in Art on December 5th. And then the topic, I must say, of my next book, not the one that's being published in the spring, but the one that I have currently under review for the next publication, Jewish Spaces in Christian Art. That is, when we see the Temple of Jerusalem, or the City of Jerusalem, or even the House of the Virgin Mary in Nazareth, in some sense, an actually real historical sense, those spaces are Jewish spaces. But when they're appropriated in Christian art and made sometimes into the Christian spaces par excellence, what does that mean? So I think it's a very full and a rich series, and I hope you'll come for all of it. But if you can't, just come for as many sessions as you can. One of the things that I take great pride in in terms of the sessions I present for CSP is that these are totally unique. You don't get, there's an occasional book or article written on the Jewish Jesus in art, right? But a whole class devoted to it, or to any of these topics, or indeed putting them all together is something that's unique and that you're really getting from CSP. And I think that it's important to acknowledge that CSP presents us with a lot of unique experiences and is worth, therefore, supporting. So let's get into it. Jews in art, not Jewish art or Jews and art. These are all topics I do discuss, but Jews in art, meaning Jews in the art of others. So there are depictions from the earliest period Middle Kingdom Egypt of the tribes called the Hibiru or the Hyksos, two different tribes who were Semitic migrants to the Nile Delta. And, there's been many attempts, and I won't go into the history of this because it's very, very fraught. Some people assert that there's nothing, just because they're called Hibiru, they have nothing to do with the Hebrews, right? Some say the Hyksos were Phoenicians. But in any case, it is true that Egypt, being the cosmopolitan center that it is, remember the Nile Delta is an inverse triangle, and it means that it has trajectories in Africa and Asia and, and going toward the Mediterranean Sea. And so it was the convergence of many, many cultures, from the Nubian culture in the south, the Ethiopic, Semitic, African culture. There were at times Nubian rulers of Lower Egypt, to the tribes that came down to Egypt for a variety of reasons. The Bible's description of Jacob and sons descending into Egypt in order to tie themselves over when a famine hits the land of Canaan is actually a reasonable and fairly realistic portrayal of the reasons that Semitic peoples sometimes made their way into Egypt. And what's interesting is that these Semitic people, whether or not they are actually Hebrews or Proto-Israelites, they're certainly not Jews because there weren't Jews in this period, right? But whether or not they're related to the ancestors of Jews, these Semitic characters are depicted, as you can see, with beards, distinctive hairstyles. They don't wear the wigs of the Egyptians, and they're often depicted as tending livestock, or as here, domesticating wild animals as domestic animals. So you have here a gentleman who has a ketonet pasim, a coat of many colors, or a checkered coat, because the Bible, the word pasim means either stripes or checks. It doesn't necessarily relate to colors, but the way we got to a coat of many colors with Joseph is the fact that checks necessitate at least two colors. Stripes necessitate at least two colors to make themselves known. So it might have been a more colorful garment than, maybe not as colorful as my garment, but more colorful than the general garment worn by Canaanites. So you have this garment that actually has fringes on it, interestingly. And this gentleman with the beard shown in profile, so you can see his sort of hook nose. Hook noses were features of Semitic characters from antiquity. It wasn't necessarily a denagrative or a sort of anti trope. It was just a way of representing people who apparently from that kind of the world had aquiline noses. And he is taming or guiding a gazelle. This is part of, that's the original, right? And you can see these wonderful paintings that archaeologists in the 19th century made of the tombs. They were more accurate than the photography of the time. So if you go to the Metropolitan Museum in New York, and I hope you will, you'll see that by the auditorium in the museum, there's a whole room full of watercolors, to scale, life-size watercolors of tomb paintings. And here you have these Semitic peoples, including men, as you see, women, and children. And they're depicted as being of a different skin color than the Egyptians, two of whom you see here. You see them with weapons, bows and spears. You see them with domesticated gazelles. You see them with donkeys. And most interestingly, you see them with a lyre. This guy has a liar, not is a liar. There are some people who are liars, and those people can achieve great things apparently in our America. But this guy has a lyre, which is a type of harp, a 5-string harp, and he's playing it. And this is sort of reminiscent of the Bible's description of the Israelites when they are in exile in Babylon. Ech nashir et shir Adonai, right? How shall we sing the song of the Lord? Why? Al aravim betochat halinu kinoratenu, right? On the willow trees in the midst of the willows of the brook in Bavel, we have hung up our harps. We have put our harps away, right? But this is many centuries anterior to that experience, and you have a Semitic man, possibly a Hebrew, who is playing the harp. And what's also interesting here is that in contrast to the Egyptians who have no shoes, these might be Egyptian servitors presenting these people to the Pharaoh, the Israelites are wearing both tivas, as you see here, and actually closed-toed shoes in the case of the women and children, right? So these might be some of the earliest depictions of Proto-Hebraic peoples. And they are therefore important. And they're in the art, of course, of others. So Jews are an object of fascination. Ancient Hebrews, whether they're Hibiru or Hyksos or actually Israelites, but ancient Semitic peoples are an object of fascination and interest to the Egyptian culture, the Middle Egyptian culture, which was an anthropologically interested culture. Just as the Bible, as we saw last week in Parshas Noach, where there's a description of the families of the earth dispersing to the 4 corners of the globe, and an attempt to create a pocket ethnography or anthropology of all the different peoples of the world. The Egyptians did that in their literature as well as in their art. The second stop on our journey is the Black Stele of Shalmaneser III, which is an Assyrian, very famous work of art, we would call it, in the British Museum. If you've talked to Raphael Zarum, he really likes this because it is this gigantic black carved obelisk with 4 sides that it's topped by a ziggurat, that is a stepped pyramid, and it has cuneiform lettering, that peculiar Sumerian, Akkadian, Assyrian, Babylonian kind of lettering that involves little triangle wedges. And it depicts a variety of ethnic groups, again, bringing tributes, bringing food and clothing and fabrics and exotic animals from each of the 4 corners of the world to the capital of the world, which is now not Egypt, but Babylon, right? And on it, on each of the 4 sides, you can see that you have both monkeys and elephants represented, bulls and rhinoceroses. Here's a 1-horned bull, which is supposed to be a rhinoceros, camels, and a variety of ethnic types of people. And they're each bringing produce, cloth, fabric, animals as tribute to the king of Babylon, who's the king of the world, right? And on one of the panels, which you see here in the original and in the drawing, we have a group of Semites, but this time we're sure who they are because their king, who's depicted here in a Phrygian, that's a pointed cap, bowing and kissing the ground before the Babylonian emperor, and under the sign of the winged sun of Shamash, the sun god, is a figure who is identified as Yehu, who is one of the kings of Judah, right? So the name is mentioned and his origin is mentioned. And here we have a bunch of people in fringed garments.
Sorry,
Right?
where is his name mentioned on this?
I'm going to show it to you in a
Okay.
second. Thanks. So just like this fringed garment that we have here, we see, and that's why there's some identification of those figures with Israelites. We see these fringed garments, and here he is bowing down before the king. There's an umbrella being held over the king's head, servitors of the king. others presenting him, right? And this is, by the way, very similar to another depiction, it's not the same depiction, here of another king from one of the other Ugaritic groups. And here is his name, Yehu, the king of Judah, and here is his face. So that is really the first depiction of a known, named Israelite person in the whole history of Western art. And you know what? He looks like my Zaidi, right? There's really there is a Semitic type. These people were not prejudiced against Israelites or Semites or any more than they were against Phoenicians or Canaanites. They just thought that they were the bosses of them, right? But all the Semitic peoples are depicted in profile very often and with prominent aquiline noses, beards, and as you see here, sort of side curls and longer hair than the Babylonians. It's a while, actually, until we come to some semblance of art that we know was made for Jews that depicts Jews. And one of the earliest and most fascinating, important examples of this are the famous mosaics of Beth Alpha. Beth Alpha is a place in the north of Israel that was the site of important kibbutz. And right at the time, around the time of the founding of the state, a little earlier, they were digging for to build a new refet, a new cow barn there, and they hit a stratum of stones. And clearing it out, they discovered magnificent mosaics of what was originally a synagogue of the Byzantine era, the fourth century. Fourth or fifth century. It's undated, right? And among the various depictions that you would expect in a synagogue of various sakra, that is the Ark of the Covenant, the Ark of the Synagogue, menorot, lampstands, lulavs and etrogs, fire pans and shovels, sort of mixture of things that applied and appended to the Jerusalem temple, but also to the life of the synagogue, right? Sort of making a connection between the Jerusalem temple, which had by then been destroyed for some 300 years, and the life of the synagogue as presently constituted. There are other mosaics, and those mosaics most famously depict a couple of things. One is the zodiac, which has caused some perplexity and interest on the part of scholars. It's something we can talk about another time, but and we have talked, I believe, at CSP about it. But the zodiac is really not a depiction of an earthly phenomenon, but a schematic diagram of the heavens, and the heavens in their role as praising God. Here we have the first complete surviving depiction of a scene from the Hebrew Bible. Not only that, but it is labeled so we know who everybody is. Not only Yitzhak, who is shown here as a young child with his hair blowing in the wind as the flames of the altar climb higher and higher, but also Yitzhak, but also Avraham, who is depicted here with a halo, interesting, and a beard, a chin beard. He looks Amish. But hine ayil, vehine ayil, and behold, the ram, right? And that's a direct biblical quote. That's one of the earliest places a direct biblical quote appears. Vehine ayil achar ve'echaz b'svach b'karnav, right? And behold, a ram, achar, we don't know what that means. Either it's a scribal corruption of the word echad, the thorn of the Dalet fell off, and we have achar, right? So it might have been a singular ram, but we have it as achar, which means somehow, we think, twisted around. According to this image, which helps clarify the understanding of the biblical text in the Byzantine period in the land of Israel, it means sort of suspended, right? But behind the scenes. So this is ayil achar. It doesn't say achar, it just says v'hinei ayil. And then a depiction of the hand of God coming out of a cloud, one of the first such depictions in all of art made for Jews. And it says al tishlach, right? Do not send forth. meaning do not send forth al tishkach yadcha el hanar, ki ata yadati ki yera Elohim ata, right? Do not send forth your hand against the boy, because now, says God, I know that you are a person who is in awe of God, who behaves as if God is in his sight, right? So you have Isaac, Abraham, the ram, and God, right? Beautiful. And then who are these two people here? Vayikach Avraham Shnei Arav Esau, right? So these are his two servants, his two young men, maybe Ishmael and Eliezer. It's not clear from the text, and a donkey with a bell on its neck. It's very charming, right? It's very atmospheric. You see the plants of the land of Israel, right? And it's also very schematic or schematic, and very basic, but you get to learn a lot about how Jews depicted their ancestors here. First of all, not caricatured, right? There's no caricature in these faces. They're very simple, but they're suggestive. Abraham's head is to the side as if he's listening, right? He's listening. Isaac has his mouth open in terror, right? As he sort of tries to flee from Abraham's hands. He's bound. You can see that his arms are crossed. You don't see the rope, but he's bound. And Abraham has in his hand the ma'achelet, the devourer, right? Now, we can learn a lot about biblical interpretation from this image. There were those who said that Isaac was 30 or 32 or 33 years old when he was brought to the sacrifice, nearly sacrificed. And there were others who said that he was very young. Obviously, the people who commissioned this work of art fell out on the very young side. It means a different thing if you think that Isaac at his binding was 30 years old, or if you think he was 3 years old, right? There are those who say that Isaac went compliantly, like, so to speak, a lamb to the slaughter. In fact, there are very few who don't say so. Ki ish echad b'lev echad, says Rashi, as a single person with a single intention, right? And yet here, Isaac is depicted as struggling. Very interesting. There's a question as what this ma'achelet, this devourer, this knife is, right? And some people say it is the gladius. The gladius was the short sword, but a short sword is a long knife used by gladiators. That's why they were called gladiators. And so we see also that the people who commissioned this saw this knife as a gladius. We also see that they held by the idea of using halos for holy figures. Is not Isaac holy? He doesn't have a halo. Well, maybe the most important figure is indicated by a halo, right? Something about the halo I'll get back to. We also see what they understood by the perplexing adjective achar, right? Behind, right? They see it as literally behind. They may see it as suspended in some way. So there's a whole lot of information here. This is one of the first depictions of Jews in art made for Jews. Was the art made by Jews? We don't know, but it doesn't have to have been. What's important is that the people who commissioned it and paid money for the commission got to depict this scene in the way that they wish to depict it, which is different than Christian depictions, which were then current already, and also later depictions by other Jews. Another very important, early around the same time, synagogue is the now disappeared synagogue of Dura Europos in Syria. Dura Europos was a border town. It was a walled city. It was built up against the desert. And in Dura Europos, as a garrison for troops and a border town, there were three cultures: the Mithraic pagan culture, worshippers of Mithras, a very early, a nascent Christian culture, and a thriving Jewish community. And we know this because there are three buildings that survived in Dura Europos because the city of Dura Europos was destroyed. How was it destroyed? Probably in a military venture, but when it was abandoned, the sands of the desert encroached, and each of these three buildings was built up against the city wall so that the sands covered them and preserved them intact. The Mithraeum is small, and it has a mural of the bull of Mithras being slaughtered. The Christian space is a baptistry, but it's actually even more minuscule. It's sort of the bath in someone's home, but above the bathtub are depicted the three Marys at the tomb of Jesus. And it is a Christian space for baptizing new Christians. And the synagogue was large and magnificent. And in the synagogue, there were depictions on the walls, on all the walls, of scenes from the Bible. Now, if you don't read Greek, you could probably still make out what this says, Aaron. And this is Aaron the high priest with his breastplate, and the temple and the menorah and the sacrifices and people standing around. Now, everybody is depicted in this Sasanian kind of Persian influenced Syrian style of the period. Everybody has an afro. All the men, the older men have beards, and they wear distinctive clothing, that is short skirted garments over pantaloons of various kinds. This is a depiction of the triumph of Mordecai. Here's Haman. Here are the Jews. The male Jews wear garments with a distinctive sign, a letter of the Greek alphabet that's embroidered onto the garment, which indicates that this is a Jewish male garment. This is something we know of from literature and is present in Dura Europos. And you have King Ahasuerus, and behind him on an elevated throne, Queen Esther, who's depicted in sort of a bodice and with a crown and with her attendants. And what's interesting about all these illustrations on the walls is, first of all, they're completely figurative. And secondly, Jews, except for some aspects of their clothing, are not distinguished in any significant way from non-Jews. Now, there are, in fact, some fascinating images of women here. This is the image of Moses being removed from his ark and brought to the Pharaoh's daughter, or conversely, I think it's an image of the Pharaoh's daughter taking Moses out of the water, and him being given by Miriam to his own mother Yocheved to nurse, but we don't really know. What's interesting is that this painting which was right to the left of the Holy Ark depicts full frontal female nudity in the form of this woman who's either the maidservant of Pharaoh's daughter, or Pharaoh's daughter herself, but that the Jewish women here are depicted only slightly differently from the servants of Pharaoh, and that distinction might be just because of class, not because of ethnicity. It's fascinating that we get to see these glimpses in this very early art. And then there's some peculiar images. Around the Holy Ark, there are 4 depictions of men. They might be 4 different men, according to some conjectures. That is, the prophet Elijah, Joshua, Moses, or they might be Moses at 4 different times in his life. What's interesting here is we have this figure with a sort of close-fitting cap on his head. His hands are covered, traditionally the sign of a prophet. A prophet was often depicted with covered hands, and this garment with the Jewish sign on it, and a strange sort of black square behind his head. Nobody's quite sure what that is, and a depiction of the sun and the moon in the sky. So some people say, and his shadow, very cleverly here, it's just like a boomerang, but it's the indication of a shadow, which gives a certain 3-dimensionality to the depiction. And some people say that this is a depiction of Joshua stopping the sun and moon in the sky. So again, we have Queen Yocheved and Miriam, we have Queen Esther at the far right, we have Aaron the high priest, and these are depictions of named known Jews in art, again, made for Jews, most likely commissioned by non-Jews. In the Roman period, we have a very famous depiction of minimally Jewish sacra. You know Steve Fine, he's done a lot of work, excellent work on the Arch of Titus in Rome. When you come with me to our tour of Jewish Italy, You will see the Arch of Titus, which is in the old Roman Forum. It commemorates the victory of Titus over Judea, Titus and Vespasian, the destruction of the temple, and the booty that was brought back to Rome from that military campaign. And like many arches of triumph, it depicts the spoils, the booty, the spoils of war, this time brought from far off Judea. The arch is regarded by the Roman Jewish community as a slap in the face. They never walked under it because they said, we walked under this arch when we were exiled from Jerusalem, and until Jerusalem is restored, we will not walk under it again. How much more so was it also a practice in the Jewish community of Rome to piss on the foundations of this arch? Now there's a fence around it, so you can't piss unless you're a sort of long scale pissing champion, which you might be, although this is not a pissing contest. But in 1948, when the State of Israel was founded, the representatives of the community did walk symbolically through the arch. And the arch famously, although in a much abraded state, shows a group of people who are carrying the menorah and other sacra, other sacred objects, the table, a table that has two silver trumpets on it, but interestingly, not the Ark of the Covenant, which was no longer in the Second Temple, through the streets of Rome, through a triumphal arch. So it's an arch that depicts an arch. It's a picture within a picture. And over the centuries, it has deteriorated considerably, but you can also see that there are placards here that are carried by these people. You have a figure here standing without anything except a wreath on his head. All these people have wreaths of victory. And the question is, who are they? Many of them are wearing short tunics. They might represent Roman soldiers, but where then is the armor of the soldiers? Short tunic was the garb of a slave. As anyone who has seen A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, one of the funniest movies in history, Go Zero Mostel. And Buster Keaton is in it, by the way, running around the 7 hills of Rome, as you may know. Anyone knows that the short garment, the short tunic is the tunic of the servant or the slave. So it may be that these people are supposed to represent Jews, captive Jews who are made to carry their own spoils through the streets. It was at least for years thought that way, but there are a number of opinions now, and the jury is out. Just some other images. The menorah is depicted on a stand that shows images from Greek mythology. So some people speculate that this stand was created for it in order to bear it through the streets. But you can see it's quite detailed. Early engraving. And they're holding, a couple of figures are holding hadassim, are holding myrtle branches, characteristic of the land of Israel. Now, Stephen Fine, along with his collaborators over a series of years, was able to, through spectrophotography and paint traces and all these things, create a reconstruction of what the image originally looked like, right? So you have these servant people who are holding staffs and bearing the table here with the silver trumpets. And it says, and these other Romans here standing, holding these myrtle leaves. So these might be generals. It might be Titus and Vespasian themselves. The menorah, and here it says leges Judaeorum, which means the laws, it might mean the representatives, right? The legal representatives of the Jews. And here candelabrum Judaeorum, the candelabrum of the Jews. And here sacra Judaeorum, the sacred objects of the Jews. And you can see the triumphal arch with this Nike with this victory figure, and then winged horses, horses and chariots at the top. It's a fascinating image of possibly Jewish figures in ancient Rome. Here's the other side of the arch, which shows Titus in his chariot. Now, Jews appear in later art, in historical paintings. this is a painting, it's a reproduction actually of a painting by a Spanish painter called Herves, which is of the destruction of the temple by the Babylonians and its sacking. And here Jews are we talk about people being cannon fodder. They're sort of camera fodder because this is a hyper realistic depiction of the temple precincts, and the Jews are being slaughtered on or at the altar. It's a very dramatic painting, but Jews here are useful just to show us, dead bodies, not a very flattering depiction. Also, Nicolas Poussin depicts Jews being cast out of the temple by Vespasian and enslaved and killed, and not a flattering image. There's a version of this in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, which was purchased for the museum. This is also, a mainstay of kitschy, postmodern Jewish art, as tear-jerking as possible, but giving you the dramatic sense of what exile from Jerusalem was like. More recently, there's been quite a wonderful film called Legend of the Destruction, and it depicts in animated form the temple and its ceremonials in order to show what brought about the destruction of the temple. And this is, just as this is an example, a lachrymose example of Jews doing the same thing that Goyim did in their paintings, showing the sorrows of the Jews. The film is interesting. I think the depiction is very, very noteworthy. I'm going to just show you a small clip. I don't know if the sound will be loud enough, but the sound is not the most important thing.
בערב יום הכיפורים ראיתי את כוכב השביט בצורת חלד שנעמד מעל העיר. בערב יום הכיפורים ראיתי את כוכב השביט בצורת חלד שנעמד מעל העיר. שבים שבשעה התשיעית של הלילה פרץ לפתע אור עצום סביב המזבח, ממש אור יום. והדלתות המזרח בית המקדש נפתח מאליו. ביום הכיפורים, בלב חרד עמדתי לידינו, וסביבנו כל אנשי ירושלים, כהני המקדש, המלכה ורניקי, רבן בן זכאי וחכמי התורה, וכולנו מחכים לתשובה. ובליבנו תפילה, השם, כפר לה לעוונות ולפשעים ולחטאים שהרבו ושפשעו ושחטאו לפניך עמך בית ישראל. האם שוב תמחה לנו? האם שוב ילבינו חוטי השני האדומים ונדע כי הלבנת את חטאינו כשלם? ברוך שם כבוד מלכותו לעולם ועד.
So that is a dramatic depiction of the temple and its protagonists. It's a new one. And the point of the whole film is that it was sinat chinam. It was causeless enmity between Jews that caused the destruction of the temple and caused the Roman destruction of Jerusalem. And so, the depictions of some of the people, the temple priests, are kind of ugly, and it's fascinating to see how Israelis now creating images of Jews, of ancient Jews, are conceptualizing them. Sorry. Okay, wait. Yeah. There is a fascination with ancient Jews on the part of 18th, 19th, 20th century artists. And when you look at compendia of costume history, it is rare that you have Jew and Jewess of low rank, etc. These depictions are clearly taken from the Middle Egyptian depictions of the Hyksos and the Ibiru. But then you have Babylonian Assyrian costume, and then depiction these from the stele of Shalmaneser III, and then of course the high priestly garment, which was a fascination for one of the aspects of ancient Jewish clothing that was a fascination for Christian artists throughout history. And comparisons made, for instance, with the breastplate of the high priest with various breastplates, and crown of the high priest with various crowns in Egyptian art, all the way into the 18th and 19th century. So fascination with that character. An ancient Jewish figure who was very often depicted by Christian artists was, of course, our friend Jesus. We'll get back to him, Jesus the Jew in Christian art, but I want to show you this one example by Henry Holman Hunt. Henry Holman Hunt was a pre-Raphaelite artist, 19th century, who actually spent a good deal of time in Jerusalem. He had a house called Tabor, which is on Rehov HaEthiopim, at the corner of Rehov HaNevi'im in Yerushalayim, and there was his studio, and from there he painted. You can go still see the studio, and he was very interested in the ancient world. He was interested in the ancient world and this sort of Jew as an object of fascination, with the caveat, or for the purposes of thinking about, well, what was like in Jesus's Jerusalem. And to that end, he went up to the Temple Mount, right, to gather architectural details. They're really late Byzantine and Arab architecture, but okay. He looked at fragments of plasterwork and stonework, and he had local Jerusalem characters, old Yemenite men, sit for him. Ashkenazic Yemenite, this blind rabbi, right? The Jews are blind, right? And then he has this young man who represents Jesus, again in a ketonet pasim, in a striped garment with fringes, and you can see this very faint glow of a halo around his head, right? But all of these things, sistra, musical instruments, harps, lyres, the way people sit, the scroll, the pen case of this gentleman, are all based on his observations. He gathered a group of artifacts that he purchased in the Jerusalem Shuk from the Jews, that he used to paint his paintings. In fact, he was so fascinated with ancient Judaism and this is not about Jewish people in art, but Jewish ideas in art, that he was interested in the Bible's account of the scapegoat, of the goat on which the sins of the Israelites that you just saw in Legend of Destruction, the goat upon which on the day of Yom Kippur, all the sins were symbolically placed, and it was sent off into the wilderness, that he purchased a goat at the Monday morning sheep and goat market outside the walls of the old city, and brought it into the Judean desert and tied it to a stake, and trigger warning for vegans and pita, not pita, bread, but PETA members. He let it starve to death in the heat as he painted it. He wanted to depict the sort of death throes of this goat. So he was very into authentic detail. And so you see that in this painting. It's really a beautiful painting. And I actually think that the detail of the Jewish figures here on the left is quite fascinating. He really gets a lot right, and a lot of it is quite meticulous. You know, contrast that with later depictions. This one isn't about Jesus. It's just a rabbi giving a sermon in the synagogue by an artist called Moritz, who was a Viennese artist who's pretty worthy of neglect. But of course, it bases itself on that trope, and it brings the ancient image into a more contemporary setting. What this person is doing here and what kind of hat they're wearing under the talus is very perplexing. Or what this is, it's all very strange, but in itself, I think, fascinating reflection on the fact that ancient Jews were of interest. Ancient Jews were of so much interest that when the first illustrated book came out in Europe, the Chinese had illustrated printed books, which is Michael Vollmergut's illustrations for Schedlin's Weltchronik in the 1490s. There are several depictions of historical figures of Judaism, including these fellows who are the Maccabees, right? And again, what's fascinating about them is that they don't really look very different than anyone else. In Hartmann Scheidel's Weltchronik, from which this is from, there are egregious, terrible depictions of Jews committing crimes, like child murder and stuff like that, in which the Jews are shown in a very negative light. But it is interesting that, except for certain small clues, like that the rabbi is blind, right? When ancient Jews are depicted by Christian, excuse me, are depicted by Christian artists, they are depicted in a neutral way. And so, for instance, the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, very famous, he went over, as you know, sorry, I've been sick for a couple of days, went over to the Roman side, is depicted in Latin manuscripts, translations of his work, right? Here's the Incipit Prologos Flavius Josephus Super Librum Antiquatum, the beginning of the prologue of Flavius Josephus on his book of Antiquities of the Jews, shows him as a respectable, it says Josephus, a respectable old Jewish gentleman with a cowl. When he was depicted in the 19th century, he was depicted in full Oriental, as they used to say, splendor. Likewise, some of the older Jewish kings who Flavius Josephus mentions, including David Hyrcanus, somebody that you don't really hear about unless you are taking courses in ancient Jewish history, are depicted as these, segific Jewish figures. So next time we will have to ask ourselves the question of what happens to non-Jewish depictors of Jews when they think about Jews in antiquity versus Jews that are contemporaries of theirs. This wonderful page is from one of these costume histories, and it depicts Jews throughout history, medieval Jews here, including this Shylock-like figure, all taken from a variety of manuscripts, some Asian Jews and Arab Jews, Jews in the 18th century in Holland and in Eastern Europe, Turkish and Ottoman Jews, and then some Karaites here. We'll have more occasion to examine this. So to review, we've thought about the very earliest depictions of Jews in, or possible Jews, proto-Jews, in Egyptian art. We've seen what happened in Babylonian art. We've seen what the Romans did. And we've seen also how Jews, mainly of the late Roman period, were depicted, which Jews were chosen for depiction, that is the high priest, most notably because of his unique and particular costume, but also the sort of normalization of the pre-contemporary Jew. In other words, if you were living in the Middle Ages and you saw Jews around them and you thought of them in negative ways, it still did not necessarily precipitate your thinking of the patriarchs and prophets in negative ways. In fact, they were often thought of in overwhelmingly positive ways, as we shall see next time. If you need to contact me, besides the questions and answers that we're going to have now, you can find me here. And I want to announce a new initiative that I'm just beginning due to my really excellent experience traveling with you at CSP. I have decided with a friend of mine, Julie Harris, who is an excellent historian and art historian, to launch a business. We're starting slowly, but we will grow and expand. And the business is called Peacock and Dragon. These are journeys of enlightenment for the discerning traveler. I am the dragon, Julie is the peacock, and we will be involving some of your favorite scholars, including some who have been at CSP as our guides. We will have excellent on the ground local guides and logisticians, just as we had in Spain. You remember Alex, don't you? Okay, Alex will participate. We will have various offices throughout the world coordinating the traffic locally, so the travel locally, so we could keep costs down. And we'll be taking you to places such as, oh, I don't know, a tour of Western Sephardic heritage, which will take us to New York, London, Amsterdam, and Gibraltar. Right? Or, for instance, since Jews were the first people in the coffee business in the Western world, we'll take you on tours of European coffee houses and cafe culture. There are many, many possible trips planned, and I look forward to sharing that with you. But for now, we are open to some questions and comments, and perhaps Ari could mediate some of those.
I will mediate if you unshare your screen too.
I will.
By the way, one of the things I learned as we get ready to go to the origins of Ashkenaz in Germany is that Jews were very involved in the beer industry.
True.
And the toy making industry out of Germany, just so you know. So a few good questions because we're late today. Number one is, how did you get permission to use all the art in your book? Are they available art, or did you have to go and get specific permission for that?
You have to pay about $400 for each of the 300 illustrations. That's how it works, which is why it's expensive to publish books, and that's why we need grants. I had to raise $36,000 to publish the book. I will
yeah.
make no profit. I have no royalties.
In writing the book, and we'll do a book talk, obviously, but is there one particular thing you want to share that was a surprise to you that you learned in that process? There were probably many things. Is there one thing you want to share?
Ooh, that's good. That's interesting. I was interested to learn that in modern ultra-Orthodox art made for Jews, by Jews actually, Haredi art, it is absolutely impermissible to depict women, one would think. And yet there is one woman who is depicted in the art that I examined. I won't tell you who she is, and I won't tell you why she's depicted, but that was interesting to learn and to discover. It's always one of the lessons you learn when you write a book is never to say never, right? Because there are always exceptions.
Good. Well, teaser, I guess, for our program. There's a question about the halo because we always think about it as a Christian thing, but you showed it to us. So, is it a Christian thing, or where does it come from in the art world?
So just as famously the depiction of Moses with horns comes from the fact that Moses's face was irradiated. Karan or Pnei Moshe. Moses's face was streaming with light, and the way in the ancient world you showed light streaming was as rays, and this was misinterpreted as horns, combined with either the idea of power, the gods, right, the horned gods, or of demonic nature, depending on how you wanted to see Moses and the Jews. So too the halo was a depiction of the charisma of a person, right? The holy charisma of a person. And halos appear in Jewish, Christian, and Muslim art. In Muslim art, they're usually halos of black or gold fire. In Jewish and Christian art, particularly in the Byzantine period, beginning of the Byzantine period, you do start to see halos. Jews use halos more discriminatingly than Christians. So Christians will show halos on every holy figure. Sometimes Jewish art made for Jews will refuse the halo because, as you say, it seems to be too Christian. Sometimes it will be given to certain figures, but not other figures, as in Beth Alpha. And really, a study of the halo in art made for Jews is a desideratum. That is something that should be undertaken.
Okay, so it's a good question. Another question is the art in Beth Alpha.
Yes.
When you compare that art to all the other art you showed us, it seems like my 6-year-old could do it. And yet it is also beautiful in its simplicity. So as an art person yourself, how do you approach that art? Is it
All, yeah.
good art? Is it interesting art but not great art? Well, what is that? It looks like.
So an art historian looks at everything in art and visual culture with the kind of even, right? So whether it's a Coca-Cola ad or a Rembrandt, we talk about what's in the art, what it means in its context, etc. A connoisseur or a critic will say, this is crap, and this is not. This is a masterpiece. I tend to blend both. I'm very opinionated about art. I think that art is largely about style. And the fact that ancient Egyptians depicted people walking like Egyptians, right? Or Byzantine art depicts people in this way, or this ancient mosaic is very schematic, is really a matter of three things really. One, what the style of the period was. And in the Byzantine period, there were simpler things and more complex things. Two, what was intended by the art. It could have been that although there were skilled artists who could have done hyper-realistic mosaics, as we see in Roman and Hellenistic contexts, the Jews specifically, because of their problem in some cases with the image, right, did not want to make it look very realistic, right? So there was a stepping back from realism. The third possibility is that they didn't have the money to pay great artists, right? So this might be bad art, right? But it certainly is art that conveys with a kind of charm and warmth and vigor, I would say, a lot of the principles that are attempting to be communicated. So I don't have really an answer to whether it's good or bad. It is, and it's interesting.
Last question for today. So when is your book actually going to be published and where and how can people get it?
Oh, okay. So it will be published by Penn State University Press, and it will be widely available on the interwebs. You've heard of the interwebs, right? This is you go on your computer, and then you can go to any independent bookstore or to Amazon if you must, and purchase it. It will also be available online from Penn State University Press. CSP will receive a cache of books that will be available as a discount and can be signed and inscribed. That is something that I'm going to make available because I love CSP and I adore Ari Katz. And I adore all of you guys, and you deserve no less than some personal attention. So we're going to do that. All right.
Is this going to be an affordable book or a very expensive?
It'll be under $60. I raised
Okay.
to subvent the cost of publication. Yes, Ida. Ida has a question. Oh no, she's just talking to her niece.
Okay. So I think we have to wrap it up.
Okay.
So
This is
next
great.
week while I'm traveling, we're going to do what? We're going to do
exemplums, or Jews as exemplary characters, priests, prophets, etc.
monarchs. Okay, great. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Mark.
Peace. See you around. Hang in there. We will
safe.
get through this. We will get through it. Just forge ahead. There's no going back.
By the way, this is not a political summit. He's talking about his 6-part series.
That's right. We will get through this series of 6 parts. Yes, we will. Love you all. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye, everybody.